The airport encounter. The lounge at Denver International Airport was abuzz with quiet activity. The subtle hum of rolling suitcases on polished tiles, muffled announcements from the PA system, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee created a cocoon of modern chaos. Travelers sat in plush chairs, many absorbed in their smartphones, laptops, or books, while others conversed softly with companions. For most, it was just another day in transit. Walter Greaves sat rigidly in a corner, his posture stiff and his face set in an expression of displeasure. His once pristine brown leather briefcase, now scuffed in age, rested by his side like a sentinel. Walter was a man of routine, someone who believed in the old ways, discipline, decorum, and respect for tradition. He clutched a steaming cup of coffee, his grip firm as though bracing against the changing world around him. He watched the lounge's occupants through narrowed eyes, his gaze lingering on a young man seated across the room. The man was tall, with sharp features and smooth dark skin. He wore a tailored navy blue suit that fit him impeccably, his polished shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights. With an air of calm confidence, the young man scrolled through his phone, unbothered by the commotion around him. Walter's lips tightened, his grip on the coffee cup intensifying. He leaned forward slightly, his thoughts spilling into words under his breath. "Sits there like he owns the place," he muttered. A woman seated nearby glanced at Walter with a frown, but he paid her no mind. Instead, he adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, louder this time. "Must be nice," he said, his voice carrying across the lounge. "Strutting around like you're someone important." The young man looked up, his face composed. His eyes met Walter's, unflinching and steady. For a moment, there was silence between them, the lounge's quiet hum punctuated only by the faint chatter of distant conversations. "Excuse me," the young man said finally, his tone polite but firm. Walter leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You heard me," he replied. "I've been around long enough to know your type. All show, no substance." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Heads turned subtly, some openly staring while others pretended not to notice the brewing tension. Walter felt emboldened by the attention, his voice growing louder. "Bet you've got nothing to your name but that overpriced suit," he added with a sneer. The young man didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he placed his phone down and folded his hands on the table in front of him. His gaze remained steady, almost disarmingly calm. "Sir," he began, "you don't know me, but you seem to have a lot to say about who I am." Walter scoffed, shaking his head. "I don't need to know you. Your type's always the same, flashy, arrogant, acting like the rules don't apply. I've worked hard my whole life, built my success from the ground up. People like you don't understand that." The young man raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "And you've decided all this about me, a stranger, based on what exactly? The way I dress? The way I look?" Walter shrugged. "Call it experience. I've seen enough people like you to know the truth." The young man tilted his head slightly, as if considering Walter's words. "Experience, or just judgment?" he asked. His tone was even, devoid of anger but sharp enough to cut through the air. A ripple of murmurs spread through the lounge. An elderly man shook his head in quiet disapproval, while a mother pulled her child closer, casting a wary glance at Walter. The tension was palpable, the atmosphere charged with discomfort. The young man didn't wait for Walter's response. He reached for his phone, glanced at the screen, and stood. "I have more important things to attend to," he said simply, his voice unwavering. "Good day." He walked away, leaving Walter fuming in his seat. The room seemed to exhale as the moment passed, but the eyes of the onlookers remained on Walter, their silent judgment heavy and unyielding. Walter muttered to himself, his words barely audible. "The world's gone soft. Can't even speak the truth without everyone getting offended." But even as he spoke, a knot of unease tightened in his chest. Had he gone too far? From across the lounge, He watched as the young man, still poised and unbothered, paced near the windows, his phone pressed to his ear. Walter's gaze lingered on him, his scowl deepening. Who was this man? Why did his presence feel so unshakable? Walter didn't know it yet, but his question would lead to a revelation that would change everything he thought he knew about himself, about the world, and about the value of true character. Shifting grounds. Walter's gaze remained fixed on the young man standing near the window. The knot of anger and humiliation in his chest refused to loosen. It wasn't just the younger man's calm dismissal that gnawed at him. It was the unsettling realization that for all his indignation, Walter felt powerless in the face of such poise. The young man had walked away as if Walter's outburst was little more than a passing inconvenience, an irritant not even worth swatting at. That stung more than Walter cared to admit. As the minutes passed, the lounge returned to its steady rhythm, but Walter couldn't shake the weight of the stares that had pinned him down moments ago. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand tightening on the armrest. Across the room, the young man, Jamal, continued his phone conversation, his gestures precise and deliberate. Walter watched him with growing suspicion. Who does he think he is? Walter muttered under his breath, though no one was near enough to hear him now. The answer came sooner than he expected. Jamal ended his call and walked purposefully toward the far side of the lounge. There, a uniformed airport employee, a middle-aged man with a security badge, was waiting. Walter's eyes narrowed as he watched the two men exchange words. The employee's posture was deferential, his gestures indicating respect and attentiveness. It wasn't the casual interaction of a passenger and staff member. It was something else. Walter's curiosity burned hotter. He straightened in his chair, his indignation momentarily replaced by the need to know. Who was this man? What gave him such an air of authority? Unable to contain himself, Walter stood and walked closer, under the guise of stretching his legs. As he neared the pair, their conversation became audible. Final checks are done, and we're ready for the pre-flight briefing, the employee said. The crew's been informed, and everything's in place as per your instructions. Good, Jamal replied, his tone calm but decisive. I'll join them shortly. Let's ensure the process stays on schedule. Walter stopped short, his chest tightening. Pre-flight briefing. Crew. The words didn't fit his assumptions about Jamal. He had expected the man to be a boastful executive, or at best, a mid-level manager playing dress-up. But this sounded different. Specific, precise, professional. The kind of talk Walter had heard only from people who held real authority. Unable to hold back, Walter stepped forward. Excuse me, he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Both men turned to look at him. Jamal's expression remained neutral, though his eyes flickered with faint recognition. Yes, he said. Walter cleared his throat, his cheeks warming under their scrutiny. Do you work for the airline? Jamal tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the question. In a manner of speaking, he replied. The vague answer only fueled Walter's frustration. What does that mean? I see you giving orders like you're running the place. The airport employee glanced at Jamal, his expression uncertain, but Jamal raised a hand, signaling him to leave. Once the man was gone, Jamal turned his full attention to Walter. His gaze was calm but piercing, like a blade wrapped in silk. I am running the place, Jamal said evenly. I'm the CEO of this airline. Walter's breath caught. He blinked, certain he had misheard. You're the CEO, he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Jamal nodded once. That's correct. The words hit Walter like a slap. He stared at Jamal, searching for any sign of mockery, a smirk, something to indicate this was a joke. But there was none. Jamal's expression remained steady, his calm demeanor unshaken. You've got to be kidding me, Walter muttered. You expect me to believe that? You're welcome to verify it, Jamal replied, his tone neutral. My name is Jamal Carter. Look it up. Walter's mind reeled. He had spent the better part of an hour belittling this man, mocking him, assuming he was some arrogant upstart with no substance. And now he was faced with the realization that Jamal wasn't just someone. He was the head of an entire airline, the very airline Walter was about to board. "This is ridiculous," Walter said, shaking his head. "You don't look like—" "Like what?" Jamal interrupted, his voice calm but cutting. "Like someone who's capable of running an airline, like someone who belongs here." Walter faltered, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but Jamal's gaze held him in place, unyielding and steady. "You decided who I was the moment you saw me," Jamal continued, his tone softening but losing none of its weight. "And you let that decision guide how you treated me. Why is that?" Walter opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Jamal took a step closer, his voice lowering. "You don't know me, Mr. Greaves. You don't know what I've worked for, what I've sacrificed, or what I've overcome. But instead of trying to understand, you chose to judge. That's on you." The silence that followed was deafening. Walter felt the weight of Jamal's words settle on his shoulders, pressing down like a stone. Around them, the lounge hummed with oblivious activity. But for Walter, the world had narrowed to this moment, this confrontation. Jamal stepped back, breaking the tension. "I have a flight to oversee," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Good day, Mr. Greaves." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Walter standing frozen in place. For a long moment, Walter didn't move. His mind churned with a storm of emotions. Anger, humiliation, confusion. But beneath it all, a nagging voice whispered something he didn't want to hear. "You were wrong." A storm within. Walter sat back down in his seat, the leather chair no longer offering the comfort it once had. His fingers tightened around the armrests, his knuckles whitening as he tried to steady himself. But his mind was a storm, the turbulence within more unsettling than any flight he had ever taken. He couldn't stop replaying the words. "I'm the CEO." It echoed in his head, challenging everything he thought he knew, everything he thought he stood for. How could he, Walter Greaves, proud, experienced, and astute, have misjudged someone so thoroughly? It wasn't just embarrassing. It was infuriating. Across the lounge, Jamal Carter had resumed his work. Walter couldn't stop watching him, his curiosity now intertwined with resentment. Jamal was poised and focused, scrolling through his laptop and occasionally taking calls with the same commanding air. He wasn't just confident. He exuded competence, an unshakable sense of purpose. Walter found it unnerving. "Mr. Greaves, would you like a refill?" The soft voice of the lounge attendant jolted him from his thoughts. He turned, blinking at the young woman holding a fresh pot of coffee. Her polite smile didn't reach her eyes, a subtle reflection of the disapproving looks he had been receiving since his earlier outburst. "No," Walter said curtly, waving her away. He could see the judgment in her gaze, the same silent condemnation he had felt from the other passengers. It gnawed at him, feeding the bitterness that had taken root in his chest. But beneath the bitterness, there was something else, a seed of doubt. It whispered to him, quiet but insistent, challenging the certainty he had clung to for so long. Had he been wrong? Was Jamal right about him? The questions made his chest tighten, his anger turning inward. As the minutes dragged on, Walter's thoughts became increasingly restless. He wasn't a man used to questioning himself. For decades, he had prided himself on his ability to read people, to judge their character with a single glance. It was a skill that had served him well in his career as an investment advisor, where intuition often mattered as much as data. But now, that skill, his prized intuition, felt like a flimsy excuse. He had looked at Jamal Carter and made assumptions, snapped judgments based on nothing more than appearance and prejudice. And now, confronted with the reality of Jamal's achievements, Walter couldn't deny the unsettling truth. He had been wrong. His gaze drifted back to Jamal, who was now speaking with another uniformed employee. Walter couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the respect in the employees' posture, the way they nodded attentively to Jamal's words. It was clear that Jamal wasn't just a figurehead. He commanded real authority, earned respect. Walter frowned, the bitterness rising again. It's just modern politics, he thought. Diversity hires and appearances. That's all this is. But even as the thought formed, it felt hollow. Jamal's composure, his competence, his obvious expertise, it didn't fit the narrative Walter wanted to believe. He stood abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. The lounge felt suffocating, the quiet hum of conversation grating on his nerves. He needed air, space, something to clear his head. Walter found himself wandering toward the large windows overlooking the runway. The sight of the planes, their sleek forms gliding across the tarmac, brought a pang of memory that he hadn't felt in years. His son, Charlie, had loved planes. The thought hit him like a wave, unexpected and overwhelming. Charlie had been fearless, his passion for aviation as boundless as the sky itself. Walter could still picture him as a boy, clutching a model airplane with a grin that lit up his face. "Someday, Dad," Charlie had said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "I'm going to be up there. I'm going to fly." Walter had encouraged him, proud of his son's dreams, but those dreams had been cut short, cruelly and without warning. Charlie had died in a small plane crash at just 19 years old, a tragedy that had shattered Walter's world. Since then, Walter had avoided planes as much as possible, blaming them for the loss he couldn't bear to face. Now, standing at the window, watching the planes come and go, the memories resurfaced with a force that took his breath away. He gripped the windowsill, his chest tightening as he fought to push the pain back down. But it was no use. The image of Charlie, so full of life, refused to be silenced. "Mr. Greaves." The voice startled him. He turned to see Jamal standing a few feet away, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Walter straightened instinctively, his pride bristling at the interruption. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone harsher than he intended. Jamal didn't flinch. "You seemed unsettled," he said simply. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Walter scoffed, turning back to the window. "I don't need your concern." There was a pause. Then Jamal stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You know, it's not easy to admit when you're wrong," he said, "but it's the first step toward understanding." Walter stiffened, his hands tightening on the windowsill. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Jamal replied, "that holding on to anger and judgment won't get you anywhere. It only makes the world smaller, lonelier." Walter turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "You think you know me?" "No," Jamal said. "I don't. But I see the way you carry yourself, the way you lash out. It's not just about me or the world changing around you. It's about something deeper, something you haven't let go of." Walter opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. He hated how easily Jamal seemed to see through him, how his calm confidence felt like a mirror reflecting back Walter's own insecurities. "You don't know what I've been through," Walter said finally, his voice low. "Then tell me," Jamal said. His tone was steady, free of judgment. "Help me understand." Walter hesitated, the weight of his grief pressing down on him. For a long moment he said nothing. But then, slowly, the words began to spill out. "My son," he said, his voice trembling. "He wanted to be a pilot, loved planes more than anything. But he didn't make it. He died in a crash when he was 19. Jamal's expression softened, a flicker of empathy crossing his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "That's a pain no one should have to bear." Walter nodded, his throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he turned back to the window, staring out at the planes. For the first time, the sight didn't fill him with bitterness. Instead, it brought a strange sense of peace, as if the memories of Charlie were finally finding a place to rest. Behind him, Jamal stood in silence, giving Walter the space he needed. And for the first time in years, Walter felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost. Hope. Turbulence within. Walter sat back in the plush lounge chair after his conversation with Jamal, his emotions a jumble of anger, shame, and something far heavier, vulnerability. For years, he had worn his bitterness like armor, shielding himself from the world. He had believed his judgments were truths, his convictions unshakable. But in a single day, this young man had managed to pierce through that armor, leaving him exposed in a way Walter hadn't felt in decades. He shifted uncomfortably, the coffee he had ordered earlier now cold and forgotten on the small table beside him. His gaze drifted again toward Jamal, who was seated farther across the lounge. The young CEO was typing on his laptop, his movements precise and efficient. Occasionally, he would pause to glance at his phone or jot down a note. His focus was unbroken, his demeanor unshaken by their earlier interactions. Walter hated that he couldn't stop watching him. He had prided himself on being a man who could read people, who could size them up with a glance. Yet, in Jamal, he had misread everything. He had assumed arrogance where there was confidence, pretension where there was skill, and unearned privilege where there was clearly hard-won achievement. It unsettled him deeply, this realization that his instincts, his self-proclaimed expertise, had failed him. As the minutes ticked by, Walter found himself spiraling into memories he had spent years trying to suppress. He thought of Charlie, his son, whose boundless love for aviation had once been a source of pride for him. Walter had encouraged that love, had stood beside him on airfields as he learned to fly, his young face lit with excitement. But when Charlie died in that crash, the joy Walter had once associated with flight turned to ashes. In the aftermath, Walter had turned inward, his grief hardening into resentment. He blamed the industry, the planes, the pilots, anyone and anything that could shoulder the weight of his loss. Over time, that resentment boiled into other areas of his life, coloring his perceptions of the world around him. "It's easier to be angry than to grieve," Walter murmured to himself, his voice barely audible. Across the room, Jamal stood and approached the gate counter. Walter followed him with his eyes, his curiosity and unease pulling him from his thoughts. Jamal spoke briefly with the gate agent, his expression serious but calm. The agent nodded and began typing on her computer. Walter felt a pang of frustration at his own curiosity. Why did he care what Jamal was doing? Why couldn't he just let it go? But the answer was clear. Jamal represented something Walter had spent years avoiding, an unyielding challenge to his worldview, to the walls he had built around himself. The boarding announcement for Walter's flight came over the loudspeaker, pulling him from his thoughts. Passengers began gathering their belongings, queuing at the gate in an orderly shuffle. Walter rose slowly, his briefcase in hand, and made his way toward the line. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he struggled to push down the storm of emotions swirling within him. He boarded the plane and found his seat near the front of the cabin. The first-class section was quiet, the soft hum of engines and the faint rustle of magazines filling the air. Walter settled into his seat, his gaze fixed on the empty space in front of him. He tried to focus on the flight ahead, on the logistics of his trip, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Jamal. The memory of their earlier exchange was sharp in his mind. Walter replayed Jamal's words over and over, his calm yet cutting tone refusing to be silenced. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom as the plane began to taxi. Walter's breath hitched when he recognized the voice. It was Jamal. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," Jamal said, his tone professional yet warm. "This is your captain speaking. We're pleased to have you aboard today. The weather looks favorable for a smooth flight, and we'll be arriving at our destination on schedule. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey." Walter's chest tightened as the realization sank in. Jamal wasn't just the CEO of the airline. He was also flying the plane. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, sitting in judgment of a man who had not only achieved unparalleled success, but who was also literally in control of his safety at this very moment. He glanced around the cabin, expecting the other passengers to react, to share in his astonishment. But they remained oblivious, their attention focused on their phones, books, or conversations. Walter felt a strange sense of isolation, as though he were the only one who understood the weight of what was happening. The plane ascended smoothly, the roar of the engines fading into a steady hum. Walter stared out the window at the clouds drifting by, their soft forms glowing in the sunlight. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of awe at the sight. It reminded him of the days when Charlie would talk endlessly about the freedom of the skies, his passion infectious. The intercom crackled again, and Jamal's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. If there's anything our crew can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask." Walter closed his eyes, his grip on the armrests loosening. Jamal's calm authority was undeniable, his voice steady and reassuring. It was a stark contrast to Walter's own state of mind, which felt anything but steady. He was adrift, caught between the man he had been and the man he could become. An hour into the flight, a flight attendant approached Walter's seat. She leaned in, her tone polite but firm. "Mr. Greaves, Captain Carter has asked if you'd like to join him in the galley for a conversation." Walter blinked, caught off guard. "He wants to talk to me." She nodded. "If you're willing." Walter hesitated, his pride urging him to refuse. But another part of him, quieter but more persistent, pushed him to accept. With a reluctant nod, he unbuckled his seatbelt and followed the attendant to the rear of the plane. Jamal was waiting in the galley, leaning casually against the counter. His posture was relaxed, but his gaze was sharp and focused. He gestured to a small table with 2 chairs. "Mr. Greaves," he said, "thank you for joining me." Walter sat down stiffly, his hands folded in his lap. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone defensive. Jamal regarded him for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to continue our conversation from earlier. I think there's more to be said." Walter shifted uncomfortably. "I don't see the point. You've already made it clear what you think of me." Jamal leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "This isn't about what I think of you. It's about what you think of yourself." The words hit Walter like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to argue but found himself speechless. Jamal's gaze didn't waver. "You've spent a lot of time judging others," Jamal continued. "But how much time have you spent looking at your own choices, your own assumptions?" Walter's chest tightened, the weight of Jamal's words pressing down on him. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "No," Jamal agreed. "But I can see the pain you're carrying, and I can see how it's holding you back." Walter looked away, his jaw tightening. He hated how easily Jamal seemed to read him, how his calm confidence exposed the cracks in Walter's defenses. "I lost my son," Walter said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He wanted to be a pilot, like you, but he didn't make it." Jamal's expression softened, a flicker of empathy crossing his face. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "That's a loss no one should have to endure." Walter nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. For a long moment, the 2 men sat in silence, the hum of the plane the only sound. "You don't have to carry that pain alone," Jamal said finally. "But you also don't have to let it define you. There's still room for growth, for change." Walter met his gaze, his defenses crumbling. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost. Hope. Wings of reflection. Walter returned to his seat after his conversation with Jamal, his steps slower, heavier, as though the weight of the exchange had somehow settled into his very bones. He sank into his chair, gripping the armrests as though they might anchor him to something solid. His mind swirled with conflicting emotions, shame, anger, and a faint but persistent glimmer of something he didn't quite recognize. Perhaps it was understanding, or maybe it was just exhaustion. Either way, it unsettled him. He glanced out the window, the vast expanse of clouds below stretching out like an endless ocean. The sunlight reflected off their soft peaks, creating a golden glow that seemed almost otherworldly. It reminded him of something Charlie had said once, not long after his first flying lesson. "Up there, it's like the whole world disappears," Charlie had said, his voice full of wonder. "It's just you and the sky. Nothing else matters." Walter had smiled at the time, ruffling Charlie's hair with pride. But now, those words brought an ache to his chest. Nothing else matters. It was a sentiment Walter had once embraced, but somewhere along the way, the weight of the world had pressed down on him, hardening his heart and narrowing his perspective. The flight attendant offered him a drink, but Walter waved her off. He wasn't thirsty. He wasn't anything, really, just tired. He shifted in his seat, his thoughts returning to Jamal. The man's words had hit harder than Walter cared to admit. They had forced him to confront truths he had buried for years, truths about himself, his bitterness, and the walls he had built around his grief. Walter wasn't used to being challenged. In his world, respect was something you demanded, not something you earned. But Jamal had flipped that idea on its head. His respect had been quiet, commanding, and undeniable. And it wasn't just the respect of others. It was self-respect. Walter could see it in the way Jamal carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he didn't flinch in the face of judgment. It was the kind of respect Walter had once aspired to, before life had worn him down. "You don't have to let it define you." Jamal's words echoed in his mind, intertwining with Charlie's voice, with memories of the past Walter had spent so long trying to escape. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Walter closed his eyes and allowed himself to drift back into those memories. He thought of Charlie's first flight lesson, the way his son had practically leaped out of the car in his excitement. Walter had stood on the tarmac, watching as the small plane lifted off, his heart pounding with equal parts pride and fear. He remembered the evenings they had spent building model airplanes together, the smell of glue and paint filling the living room. Charlie had always been meticulous, carefully assembling each piece with the precision of a seasoned engineer. "One day, Dad," he would say, his eyes bright with determination, "I'm going to build a real one." Walter had believed him. He had believed in Charlie's dreams with a conviction that bordered on certainty. And then, in one cruel instant, those dreams had been torn away. The phone call, the rush to the hospital, the devastating finality of the doctor's words. It had all blurred together into a nightmare Walter couldn't wake up from. The plane jolted slightly, the turbulence pulling Walter back to the present. He opened his eyes, the hum of the engine steadying him. The flight attendant walked by, checking on passengers, and Walter gave her a small nod. He could feel the tension in his shoulders, the heaviness in his chest, but he also felt something else, a faint stirring of resolve. Walter reached into his briefcase and pulled out a notebook. It was old, the leather cover worn and cracked from years of use. He flipped through its pages, his fingers brushing over the notes and sketches within. It had once been Charlie's. After his death, Walter had kept it, unable to bring himself to open it until now. The pages were filled with designs for airplanes, detailed and intricate. Charlie had dreamed big, his imagination unfettered by the constraints of reality. Walter's chest tightened as he read the notes scrawled in the margins, the enthusiasm practically leaping off the page. Lightweight materials for better fuel efficiency. Adjustable wings for better control in turbulence. One day, I'll make this real. Walter closed the notebook, his hands trembling. He had spent so many years avoiding this, avoiding Charlie's memory, because it hurt too much. But now, for the first time, he felt a strange sense of connection. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was pride. Charlie had dreamed of flying, of creating something that could touch the sky. And while his life had been cut short, his passion lived on in these pages, in the memories Walter carried with him. Jamal's voice crackled over the intercom again, announcing their descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing. On behalf of myself and the crew, thank you for flying with Horizon Airways." Walter's grip on the notebook tightened. He glanced out the window again. the clouds thinning as the plane descended toward the city below. The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows over the landscape, painting the world in hues of orange and gold. For the first time in years, Walter felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since Charlie's death. The urge to try, to reach for something beyond his bitterness, to take a step forward, even if it was small. When the plane landed, Walter waited for the other passengers to disembark before rising from his seat. He stepped into the aisle, clutching Charlie's notebook as though it were a lifeline. As he approached the cockpit, he saw Jamal standing with the flight crew, his posture relaxed, but his presence commanding. Walter hesitated, his pride battling with the newfound resolve in his chest. Then, summoning every ounce of courage he had left, he stepped forward. "Captain Carter," he said, his voice rough but steady. Jamal turned, his expression calm. "Mr. Greaves," he replied with a small nod. "How was the flight?" Walter hesitated, his fingers tightening on the notebook. "It was enlightening," he said finally. "I owe you an apology. For earlier. For everything." Jamal studied him for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he nodded again. "I appreciate that," he said. "But the real question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned?" Walter swallowed hard, his throat tight. He held up the notebook, his voice trembling. "My son, Charlie. He loved planes, loved flying. This was his." Jamal's expression softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "And now?" Walter took a deep breath. "Now," he said, "I think it's time I stop running from it. From him. From everything." Jamal extended a hand, his grip firm. "Good," he said. "It's never too late to start again." As Walter stepped off the plane and into the terminal, he felt the weight in his chest begin to lift. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to take the next step. Horizons of change. Walter stood at the edge of the terminal, the cacophony of airport announcements, the hurried clatter of luggage wheels, and the hum of countless conversations fading into the background. The notebook in his hand felt heavier than its physical weight, as though it carried not only the memory of his son, but also the burden of years of grief and bitterness. He stared out through the massive glass windows at the planes taxiing on the tarmac, their movements purposeful and steady. The sight stirred something deep within him, a faint ember that he hadn't felt in years. "Mr. Greaves." Walter turned at the sound of Jamal's voice. The young CEO had approached quietly, his presence as steady as ever. He was out of uniform now, dressed in a sharp but understated suit. For the first time, Walter noticed the weariness in Jamal's eyes, a subtle reflection of the weight he must carry every day. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Walter admitted, his voice rough but calmer than it had been earlier. Jamal offered a small smile. "I wasn't sure I'd see you either, but I wanted to make sure you were all right." Walter hesitated, then nodded. "I'm getting there." Jamal glanced at the notebook in Walter's hand. "That belonged to your son, didn't it?" Walter's grip on the leather cover tightened, his knuckles whitening. "Yes," he said quietly. "Charlie. He wanted to be a pilot, loved planes more than anything, but he never got the chance." He paused, his voice catching. "And I guess I never got over it." Jamal's expression softened, his voice steady. "Losing someone you love, it leaves a mark. But it doesn't have to define you. It can be the foundation for something new." Walter looked down at the notebook, his thoughts churning. "For years, I thought shutting out the pain would protect me. But it didn't. It just made me angry. At the world. At people like you. And for what? It didn't bring him back." Jamal nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Pain has a way of doing that. It tricks us into thinking that building walls will keep us safe. But those walls don't just keep the pain out. They keep everything else out too, including the things that could help us heal." Walter met Jamal's gaze, his own eyes heavy with unshed tears. "You said something earlier, on the plane. About respect. About how it's something you earn, not something you demand." He paused, swallowing hard. "I think I've been demanding respect for all the wrong reasons, and I've been blind to the people who deserve it most." Jamal didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to settle between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "Acknowledging that is a start, but the real work begins with what you do next." The two men sat down on a nearby bench, the bustling terminal moving around them like a tide. Walter opened the notebook, his hands trembling as he flipped through its pages. The sketches and notes inside were a testament to Charlie's passion, each line drawn with care and precision. Walter's chest tightened as he read the words scrawled in Charlie's handwriting. "Dream big, always." "I don't know what to do with all of this," Walter admitted, his voice barely audible. "How do you move forward from something like this?" Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You honor it," he said simply. "You take what he left behind and use it to build something meaningful, something that would make him proud." Walter looked up, his brow furrowed. "How? I'm just an old man. I don't know the first thing about making dreams come true anymore." Jamal smiled faintly. "It's never too late to learn. And you're not alone. There are people who can help you, who can guide you. But you have to be willing to take that first step." The conversation lingered with Walter long after Jamal left to catch his next flight. As the hours passed and the terminal began to quiet, Walter found himself staring at the notebook again, his mind racing with possibilities. The bitterness that had defined him for so long was still there, but now it was tempered by something else, a faint but growing sense of purpose. He thought about the model airplanes Charlie had built, the hours they had spent together tinkering and dreaming. He thought about the pride he had felt watching his son take to the skies, and the crushing grief that had followed his loss. But for the first time in years, Walter realized that the love he had for Charlie didn't have to end with his death. It could be the spark that ignited something new. 2 months later, Walter stood at the edge of a small airfield, the crisp autumn air biting at his cheeks. In front of him was a group of young students, their faces alight with the same excitement he had once seen in Charlie's. They were part of a nonprofit organization Walter had helped fund and establish, an initiative to provide aviation training and mentorship to underprivileged youth. The idea had come to him after that fateful flight with Jamal. He had pored over Charlie's notebook, finding inspiration in his son's dreams and using them as the foundation for the program. It hadn't been easy. There were moments when the grief threatened to overwhelm him, when the doubts crept back in. But each time, he thought of Charlie, of Jamal's words, and of the promise he had made to himself to do better. "Mr. Greaves," one of the instructors called, pulling him from his thoughts. "We're ready for the first flight." Walter nodded, his heart pounding as he watched a small plane taxi down the runway. Inside were 2 students, their faces pressed eagerly to the windows. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing into the sky with the same grace and determination that had once captivated Charlie. As the plane disappeared into the clouds, Walter felt a tear slip down his cheek. But this time, it wasn't just grief. It was something deeper, something brighter. It was hope. Later that evening, Walter sat in his office, the notebook open in front of him. He picked up a pen and added a note to the final page, his handwriting unsteady but deliberate. "Dream big, always, and never stop flying." He leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of an airplane engine drifting through the open window. For the first time in years, Walter felt at peace. The journey wasn't over, but he was finally on a path that felt right, a path that honored Charlie's memory, embraced his own growth, and opened his heart to the possibility of change. A new flight. Walter sat at the airfield long after the last plane had landed for the evening. The small group of students had long since dispersed, their laughter and excitement still echoing faintly in his mind. He had stayed behind, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. The open notebook lay in his lap, its pages fluttering in the gentle breeze. For years, he had avoided this very moment, being surrounded by the world Charlie had loved so much. planes, the sky, the boundless hope of youth. All of it had felt like a painful reminder of what he had lost. But now, sitting there, he felt something different. The ache was still there, yes, but it was no longer a weight dragging him down. It was a reminder of the love he had carried for his son, and it gave him strength. The next morning, Walter received a message from Jamal. It was short, but it carried the weight of their shared moment months earlier. "I heard about your program. Well done. Let me know how I can help." Walter stared at the message for a long time, his lips curling into a faint smile. He had never expected to hear from Jamal again, but the young man's offer didn't surprise him. Jamal had a way of understanding people, of seeing their potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. Walter replied with a simple, heartfelt message. "Thank you. I'd like that." Months turned into years, and Walter's program grew. The small airfield became a bustling hub of activity, with students from diverse backgrounds flocking to take part in the aviation training. Walter worked tirelessly, not just as a benefactor but as a mentor. He shared stories of Charlie, of his passion for flight, and of the lessons Walter had learned about resilience, growth, and letting go of bitterness. One day, as Walter stood at the edge of the runway watching a student pilot take off for their solo flight, he felt a familiar presence beside him. He turned to see Jamal, dressed casually but still carrying that unmistakable air of quiet authority. "You've done well, Mr. Greaves," Jamal said, his tone warm but measured. Walter chuckled softly. "You can call me Walter. I think we've earned that by now." Jamal smiled. "Fair enough, Walter. I'm impressed by what you've built here. It's inspiring." Walter nodded, his gaze returning to the sky. "I had a good teacher," he said, "even if I didn't realize it at the time." Jamal glanced at him, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it takes turbulence to find the right path." Walter laughed, a genuine, hearty sound that felt foreign to him even as it escaped his lips. "That it does," he agreed. As the years passed, Walter found himself changing in ways he never thought possible. The bitterness that had once defined him became a distant memory, replaced by a sense of purpose and fulfillment. He became a beloved figure in the community, not because he demanded respect, but because he earned it through his actions and his willingness to grow. Charlie's notebook remained his most treasured possession, its pages a constant source of inspiration. He often read through it, marveling at the ambition and creativity of his son, and every time he looked at it, he felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that Charlie's dreams were still soaring, carried forward by the students who shared his love of flight. On a crisp autumn morning, years after that fateful encounter at the airport lounge, Walter stood before a crowd gathered at the airfield. The program he had started was celebrating its 10th anniversary, and dozens of graduates had returned to honor the milestone. Among them were pilots, engineers, and aviation enthusiasts, each with their own story of how the program had changed their lives. As Walter addressed the crowd, his voice steady and clear, he couldn't help but think of how far he had come. He spoke of Charlie, of the lessons he had learned, and of the importance of dreaming big and believing in others. When the applause died down, Jamal approached him, a small plaque in his hands. "This is for you," Jamal said, presenting it to Walter. The plaque read, "In honor of Walter Greaves, whose vision and resilience have given wings to countless dreams." Walter accepted the plaque, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice trembling. "But this isn't just for me. It's for Charlie, and for everyone who dared to believe in something bigger." As the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Walter found himself alone at the edge of the runway once more. He looked up at the sky, the clouds drifting lazily overhead. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of regret or loss. Instead, he felt the quiet, steady strength of a man who had learned to fly again, not in a plane, but in his heart. "Dream big, always," he whispered, echoing Charlie's words as the wind carried them upward, toward the endless horizon. And this time, Walter knew he wasn't grounded anymore.